The accession of Richard II. Richard II, born in 1367, was crowned King of England at the tender age of 10, following the death of his grandfather, King Edward III. His reign began on a note of promise, with the nation hopeful for a young and capable monarch. However, this optimism was soon tempered by the realities of medieval politics and the challenges that would shape his early years on the throne. At the time of Richard's accession, the kingdom was in a state of relative peace, but tensions were brewing beneath the surface. England had been involved in the 100 Years' War against France for several decades, and the kingdom's resources were stretched thin. The nobility, particularly the powerful figures within the royal court, held significant sway over the kingdom's affairs, and Richard, being so young, was left largely under their influence. For the first few years of his reign, Richard's role was largely ceremonial. The real power was in the hands of his regents and the court, especially his uncle, John of Gaunt. John was a formidable figure, one of the most powerful nobles in England, and it was he who guided Richard during his early years. Despite his potential as a king, Richard was a mere child, and his decisions were often made with the advice and guidance of those around him. Richard's coronation, though grand, was symbolic of the way his reign would begin, as a figurehead surrounded by those with more experience and political power. The ceremony took place in Westminster Abbey, and it was attended by many of England's most influential figures. The atmosphere was one of celebration, but also one of expectation. Richard, with his innocent face, was a young king thrust into the limelight, yet his authority was not yet truly his own. During these early years, Richard was greatly influenced by the advisors around him. The regents and nobles were tasked with guiding the young king, but they were also keen on maintaining their own power. Richard's relationship with his advisors was one of reliance, but this dependency also left him vulnerable to manipulation. As he grew older, the young king would come to realize that his kingdom was not entirely his to rule, and that the power of the throne was shared with the influential noble class. The young Richard, though intelligent and sensitive, was not equipped to handle the complex and often dangerous political landscape of medieval England. As a child king, he had little say in the decisions that would shape his kingdom. The early years of his reign were marked by a lack of personal involvement in the affairs of the state. This began to change as Richard matured, but by then, the seeds of his eventual downfall had already been sown. Richard's reliance on the nobles, especially during his formative years, created a fragile foundation for his future rule. The nobles, while loyal at first, would become increasingly disillusioned with the young king as he tried to assert his independence. Richard's struggle to balance the needs and desires of the nobility with his own emerging sense of authority would eventually lead to the unravelling of his reign. The lesson from Richard II's early years is clear. A ruler must learn to navigate the delicate balance of power. While it is natural for a young king to rely on advisors and regents, a ruler must also develop the strength and wisdom to make independent decisions. Richard's inability to assert his authority early on left him vulnerable, and his reign, though filled with promise, would soon be plagued by political missteps and growing unrest. This chapter sets the stage for the complexities and challenges that Richard II would face throughout his reign. His early years were marked by reliance on others, but as he grew older, his desire for independence would set him on a path that would ultimately lead to conflict, rebellion, and the loss of the throne. The influence of the nobles. As Richard II's reign progressed, the influence of the nobles over his decisions grew. While Richard had the formal power of the throne, much of the kingdom's governance was handled by his powerful advisors and the noble families. These nobles, who had long been entrenched in the court, were highly influential figures, each seeking to safeguard their own interests while manipulating the young king to their advantage. In these early years of his reign, Richard was often left in the hands of his uncle, John of Gaunt, who served as a key advisor and regent. John of Gaunt, one of the most powerful men in England, had significant sway over Richard's decisions. However, his influence was not the only one at play. Richard's court was filled with competing factions of nobles, each with their own agendas. Richard, though he was the monarch, found himself reliant on these noble families for counsel and guidance. Richard's early interactions with the nobles were marked by a lack of independence. The young king often deferred to his advisors on crucial matters, and as a result, his power was not fully realized. His early decisions were often swayed by the advice and influence of others, and the court quickly became divided as different factions vied for control. Richard's youthful innocence and his reliance on his advisors made him vulnerable to manipulation, as the nobles saw an opportunity to control the direction of his reign. The balance of power at Richard's court shifted over time as the influence of his advisors grew. The nobles, who had long been accustomed to wielding power behind the throne, took advantage of Richard's youth and inexperience to advance their own positions. Richard was caught in a web of political intrigue and factionalism, unsure of whom to trust and who had his best interests at heart. This lack of strong leadership from the king allowed the nobles to consolidate their power and further distance Richard from the true reins of power. One of the key lessons from this period of Richard's reign is the danger of relying too heavily on advisors. A monarch must be able to assert their authority and make independent decisions, even when surrounded by powerful factions. Richard's failure to do so left him vulnerable to the whims of those around him, and as the nobles grew more powerful, Richard's authority waned. His inability to navigate the complex political landscape of his court set the stage for the challenges he would face later in his reign. The influence of the nobles continued to shape Richard's reign as their grip on power tightened. As Richard sought to assert his independence, the nobles pushed back, leading to a struggle for control over the throne. The court became a battleground for influence, and Richard's inability to navigate this political minefield would ultimately contribute to his downfall. His failure to establish a strong, independent voice in the governance of England would define the course of his reign. In the end, the influence of the nobles played a crucial role in the downfall of Richard II. His dependence on others for guidance and his inability to assert his own authority created an environment where his power was undermined at every turn. The lesson here is that a ruler must be able to stand firm, make decisions based on their own vision for the kingdom, and not allow their power to be diminished by the influence of others. Richard's reign, though marked by potential, was ultimately undermined by his inability to do this. The early political mistakes. As Richard II grew older, his desire to assert his independence became more apparent. However, his attempts to centralize power and reduce the influence of the nobles were met with resistance. The early political mistakes Richard made during this period would prove to be the beginning of a long decline in his reign. His lack of political savvy and his impulsive decisions contributed to the growing dissatisfaction among the nobility and ultimately led to the erosion of his authority. One of Richard's first major political mistakes was attempting to bypass traditional governance structures in favour of a more centralized monarchy. While this was a move toward asserting royal power, it alienated the very nobles who had long held significant influence in the kingdom. Richard's attempts to reduce their power were seen as a direct challenge to their status and privileges. This created a rift between the king and the nobility, setting the stage for the political instability that would define his reign. Richard's impulsive nature also played a role in his early political mistakes. He often made decisions without consulting his advisors or considering the long-term consequences. This led to several hasty actions that alienated key figures in the kingdom. For example, Richard's decision to dismiss experienced advisors in favour of younger, more loyal followers created a power vacuum at court. This allowed ambitious nobles to seize control of key positions and undermined Richard's ability to make decisions on his own. Another significant mistake Richard made was his failure to address the growing discontent among the common people. While the nobles held power in the kingdom, the peasants and lower classes also played a critical role in the stability of the kingdom. Richard's failure to address their grievances, particularly in the wake of the Black Death, contributed to the simmering unrest that would later boil over into the Peasants' Revolt. His inability to recognize and act on the needs of the common people further isolated him from the rest of the consequences of these political mistakes were far-reaching. As Richard attempted to consolidate power, he only succeeded in alienating key allies and increasing the resentment of the nobility. His failure to maintain balance in his court and his impulsive decision-making left him vulnerable to rebellion. By the time Richard attempted to regain control, the nobles had already begun to turn against him, and his authority had eroded beyond repair. Richard's early political mistakes serve as a reminder of the importance of wisdom, patience, and the ability to navigate complex political relationships. A monarch must understand the dynamics of their court and the delicate balance of power between the monarchy and the nobility. Richard's failure to grasp these concepts led to the instability and rebellion that would ultimately cost him his throne. The lesson from this chapter is clear. A ruler must be strategic in their actions and decisions. Impulsiveness and a desire for unchecked power can lead to disastrous consequences. Richard's inability to balance the interests of the nobility, the common people, and his own desires set the stage for his eventual downfall. His reign, though full of potential, was ultimately marred by his inability to make wise political decisions, and it serves as a cautionary tale for future leaders. Richard II's early years under the influence of advisors. As Richard II continued his reign, his dependence on powerful advisors became more pronounced. The young king, despite his title and authority, was often guided by those who surrounded him in the royal court. Early in his rule, Richard leaned heavily on his regents, particularly his uncle, John of Gaunt, and a group of trusted nobles. This reliance on advisors shaped much of his early political decisions, often leaving him at the mercy of the political dynamics within his court. Richard's dependence on the advice and influence of the nobles became evident early on. As a young king, he lacked the experience and the knowledge required to make independent decisions. The nobles, sensing Richard's vulnerability, began to assert their own influence, positioning themselves as the true power behind the throne. John of Gaunt, being one of the most powerful figures in England at the time, played a significant role in shaping Richard's early years on the throne. Though Gaunt was a loyal supporter of Duke of Arm, during these early years, Richard had little personal involvement in the governance of England. His advisors made key decisions, from foreign policy to domestic matters, while Richard's role remained largely ceremonial. Although Richard held the crown, his ability to act independently was limited, and the true power of the throne lay in the hands of those who surrounded him. This made him highly dependent on the political interests and ambitions of the nobles, who sought to use him for their own advantage. Despite being heavily influenced by his advisors, Richard II showed signs of becoming more independent as he matured. However, his early years as a king set a precedent for how he would rely on others to shape his decisions. This pattern of relying on external influence would continue throughout his reign, leading to further instability and weakening his power. The nobility, sensing Richard's need for guidance, continued to exert control, leading to an ongoing tension between the monarchy and the nobles. One key moment that illustrated Richard's dependence on his advisors occurred when he sought counsel during the early years of the 100 Years' War. The war, which had been ongoing between England and France, required critical military and political decisions. Richard's advisors, including John of Gaunt, took control of the war efforts, while Richard was kept in the background, merely signing off on decisions made by his advisors. Though Richard was technically the king, the war efforts were carried out largely by this lack of direct involvement in the kingdom's major decisions created a deep divide between Richard and the nobles. The powerful families within the court began to see Richard as a figurehead, someone who could be easily manipulated. As the years went on, Richard's inability to assert his own authority would come back to haunt him, as the nobles grew increasingly powerful and began to undermine his rule. The lesson from Richard II's early years is clear. A ruler must learn to balance the guidance of advisors with the strength to act independently. While relying on trusted advisors is necessary, a monarch must maintain control over their own decisions and not allow external influences to dictate the course of the kingdom. Richard's failure to assert his own authority, especially in his early years, ultimately led to his downfall. His reign, which began with great potential, was marred by the failure to take control. Struggles with power and authority. As Richard II's reign continued, the young king's attempts to assert his power were met with growing resistance from the nobility. While he had the crown, Richard lacked the support necessary to maintain control over his kingdom. His attempts to centralize authority, reduce the power of the nobles, and exert more personal control over England's affairs were seen as a direct challenge to the established order. The growing rift between Richard and the powerful noble families of England would mark. One of Richard's early struggles with authority came when he attempted to bypass the traditional power structures and consolidate more control in the hands of the monarchy. At a time when the nobles had long held significant influence over the king's decisions, Richard sought to reduce their influence by increasing the power of the crown. This led to widespread dissatisfaction among the nobles, who viewed Richard's efforts as an attack on their traditional privileges. In particular, Richard's attempts to assert his power were further complicated by his reliance on unpopular advisors. While these advisors were loyal to the king, they lacked the influence and respect of the powerful noble families. As Richard tried to push through reforms and centralize authority, the nobles pushed back, using their wealth, military power, and influence to resist his efforts. The young king was caught between his desire to assert his authority and the resistance of those who had the power to challenge him. One of the most significant confrontations during this period occurred when Richard tried to diminish the power of the king's closest allies, including his uncle, John of Gaunt. John, a powerful nobleman with vast landholdings, had significant influence over Richard's reign, but Richard's growing desire to centralize power led him to challenge Gaunt's position. This move, however, backfired. Rather than securing more control, Richard's actions alienated one of his most powerful allies and increased the. Another issue that Richard faced was his inability to balance the interests of different factions within the court. The nobility was deeply divided, and Richard struggled to navigate the complex web of allegiances, rivalries, and ambitions within the court. His inability to foster unity among the powerful factions of his kingdom further weakened his position. As Richard became more determined to centralize power, he found himself increasingly isolated from the very groups he needed to support him. In the face of growing resistance, Richard became more erratic in his decisions. Rather than adjusting his approach to win back the support of the nobles, he doubled down on his efforts to consolidate power, often making impulsive and rash decisions. These decisions further alienated his supporters, leading to a breakdown in trust between Richard and the nobles. As the king became more isolated, the nobility began to assert their power, ultimately pushing Richard into a position where he could no longer. The lesson from this chapter is clear. A ruler must balance the need for authority with the necessity of maintaining relationships with key factions. Overreach, impulsive decisions, and failure to secure loyalty from powerful groups can quickly lead to the erosion of power. Richard II's inability to navigate these delicate political dynamics ultimately contributed to his downfall. A monarch must ensure that they build strong, trusting relationships with their advisors and the nobility to prevent disloyal. The consequences of Richard's political failures. As Richard II's reign progressed, the consequences of his early political mistakes began to take their toll. The political instability in England deepened as Richard's relationships with the nobility deteriorated. The nobles, who had once supported him, became increasingly hostile, and their growing discontent fueled a series of challenges to Richard's rule. His failure to effectively navigate the political landscape would lead to a number of disastrous decisions and ultimately set the stage for his. Richard's inability to forge strong relationships with the nobility became his greatest vulnerability. As the nobles grew dissatisfied with his attempts to centralize power and bypass traditional authority structures, they began to form alliances with one another, seeking to protect their own interests at the expense of the king's authority. Richard's efforts to assert his control over the kingdom were seen as a direct threat to the power of the aristocracy, leading to increasing resistance from the. One of the first signs of Richard's failure to maintain noble support came with his handling of the Peasants Revolt of 1381. The revolt was sparked by a combination of heavy taxation, social inequality, and the impact of the Black Death. Though Richard was initially able to negotiate with the peasants and quell the uprising, his response to the rebellion alienated key figures in the nobility. Rather than using the revolt as an opportunity to unite the kingdom, Richard's handling of the situation created. As Richard's relationship with the nobility continued to deteriorate, his authority was further undermined by his reliance on unpopular advisors. His decisions, often made in isolation from the nobility, were viewed as impulsive and misguided. Richard's increasing reliance on a small circle of trusted advisors, rather than seeking counsel from the broader nobility, further isolated him from the powerful factions in his court. This lack of communication and trust between the king and the nobles fueled the breakdown in Richard's relationship with the nobility culminated in the rise of Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt. Bolingbroke's return to England in 1399 marked the beginning of the end for Richard II. Bolingbroke, supported by a growing faction of nobles, claimed that he was returning to reclaim his inheritance, but his true goal was to challenge Richard's rule. The growing support for Bolingbroke was a clear indication of the declining support for Richard, and it marked the turning. Bolingbroke's return and subsequent rebellion further solidified Richard's political isolation. Richard's failure to maintain control over his court and the growing unrest among the nobles allowed Bolingbroke to rally support and gain momentum. The nobles, once loyal to Richard, began to pledge allegiance to Bolingbroke, and the king found himself unable to control the situation. The political instability that Richard had failed to address for years had finally come to a head, and his rule was doom. Richard II's political failures ultimately led to his downfall. His inability to balance the competing interests of the nobility, his impulsive decision-making, and his failure to maintain strong relationships with key factions within his court contributed to his loss of power. The consequences of his early mistakes were profound, and they paved the way for the eventual rise of Henry IV. Richard's reign serves as a cautionary tale for future rulers about the importance of political wisdom, the need to make. The outbreak of the Peasants' Revolt. In 1381, the peasants of England, already burdened by heavy taxation and economic hardship, rose up in revolt. The causes of the Peasants' Revolt were rooted in both long-standing social inequality and the immediate pressures faced by the common people. The Black Death had decimated much of the population, causing labour shortages, which led to higher wages and a higher demand for goods. The government, desperate for revenue to fund the ongoing war with France, imposed heavy taxes, including a poll tax. At the heart of the revolt was the imposition of the poll tax, a flat tax that affected all people, regardless of wealth. For the peasants, already struggling with economic hardship, this tax was the final straw. Led by figures such as Wat Tyler, the peasants marched toward London, determined to make their voices heard and demand a change. As they advanced, their numbers grew, and the rebellion began to take on a wider, more organised scope. Richard II, still a young king, faced a difficult challenge in managing the revolt. The peasants, driven by anger and desperation, gathered outside London, demanding an end to the tax and the abolition of serfdom. As the leader of the nation, Richard II had to make a decision, whether to negotiate with the rebels or suppress them by force. The decision he made would have long-lasting consequences for his reign and the future of England. On June 13, 1381, Richard II rode out to meet the rebels in an effort to pacify the situation. Wat Tyler, the leader of the revolt, approached the king with demands for reforms and an end to the oppressive system. Richard, though young and inexperienced, spoke directly to the rebels, offering them a sense of hope. The king's speech seemed to calm the crowd, and many of the peasants were persuaded to lay down their weapons. However, as the day wore on, tensions escalated. Tyler was killed by one of Richard's men, and the crowd's mood shifted. In the wake of Tyler's death, the revolt lost its leadership, and the peasants, now leaderless, began to lose their focus. Richard's opportunity to negotiate peace was squandered, and the rebellion turned into a bloodier affair. The remaining rebels were eventually crushed by the royal army. Although the peasants' revolt was ultimately suppressed, it had far-reaching consequences. The uprising was a clear indication that the social fabric of England was fraying, and it highlighted the deep resentment felt by the lower classes. Richard II's failure to effectively manage the revolt and address the root causes of the peasants' anger only served to further alienate the common people. The lesson from this chapter is that a ruler must be able to listen to the grievances of their people and address the underlying issues that cause unrest. Richard's inability to fully comprehend the depth of the rebellion and his hasty decision to suppress it led to the loss of trust between him and his subjects. A monarch who fails to understand the needs of the people risks losing their loyalty, as Richard II would learn the hard way. Richard II's response to the revolt. As the peasants' revolt gathered momentum, Richard II, who was still a young king, had to decide how to respond to the demands of the rebels. The situation was precarious, with a growing army of peasants marching toward London, demanding an end to the poll tax and other reforms. Richard, surrounded by his advisors, faced a critical decision that would shape the future of his reign and determine whether he could quell the rebellion without further alienating the common people. On June 13, 1381, Richard made the bold decision to meet with the rebels personally. The young king, eager to show his authority while also calming the situation, rode out from the Tower of London to meet the leader of the revolt, Wat Tyler. The moment was symbolic of Richard's attempt to maintain control and assert his kingship in the face of growing unrest. Surrounded by his royal guard, Richard met Tyler and the peasants, offering a message of peace and reconciliation. The initial meeting between Richard and the rebels seemed to be going well. Wat Tyler, a charismatic leader of the revolt, presented the rebels' demands to the king, asking for the abolition of serfdom and an end to oppressive taxation. Richard, acting with remarkable maturity for his age, offered promises of reform, hoping to placate the angry crowd. The king's willingness to engage in dialogue with the peasants was seen as a rare opportunity for compromise, and many of the rebels began to disperse, believing. However, as the meeting continued, tension began to rise. Richard's men, eager to ensure the safety of the king, grew increasingly wary of the crowd's intentions. The situation came to a head when Wat Tyler, the leader of the revolt, was struck down by one of Richard's men. The moment Tyler was killed, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The rebels, who had been hopeful just moments before, now turned hostile and angry. The death of their leader shattered any remaining sense of trust in Richard. In the aftermath of Tyler's death, the remaining peasants began to regroup and rally under new leadership. Richard, realizing the gravity of the situation, attempted to reassure the crowd, addressing them directly and offering more promises. However, the damage had been done. The killing of Wat Tyler led to further unrest, and the peasants, now without their leader, were unable to effectively organize. Though Richard had made attempts at negotiation, his inability to handle the tension and his failure to prevent Tyler's. The response to the Peasants' Revolt marked a turning point in Richard II's reign. While Richard initially tried to quell the rebellion through dialogue, the events of June 1381 demonstrated his lack of control over the situation. His failure to manage the revolt and the death of Wat Tyler signaled the beginning of a breakdown in trust between the monarchy and the common people. Richard's inability to effectively navigate the crisis and resolve the rebellion ultimately led to his loss of credibility. The lesson here is that a ruler must be able to navigate the complexities of conflict resolution. While engaging with rebellious factions is important, the ability to maintain control, prevent violence, and offer tangible solutions is crucial. Richard II's failure to manage the situation with the peasants was a significant misstep in his reign, one that contributed to the erosion of his authority and the eventual downfall of his rule. The long-term consequences of the revolt. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was a pivotal moment in Richard II's reign, marking not only a significant challenge to his authority, but also a turning point in the relationship between the monarchy and the common people. Though the revolt was eventually quelled, its aftermath had lasting consequences for Richard's reign and for the political landscape of England. The rebellion highlighted the growing divisions in society and the deep resentment felt by the lower classes, which Richard failed to address. In the immediate aftermath of the revolt, Richard II attempted to maintain his position by issuing promises of reform. He promised to lower taxes and end serfdom, but these promises were not followed through, and the common people quickly realized that they had been deceived. The failure to meet the demands of the peasants not only led to widespread disillusionment among the lower classes, but also further eroded Richard's credibility as a ruler. His inability to address the underlying grievances of the long-term consequences of the revolt were far-reaching. Richard's reign, once filled with potential, began to unravel as a result of his failure to effectively deal with the rebellion. His authority was further undermined by the disillusionment of the common people and the increasing power of the nobles. As the nobility grew stronger and more independent, Richard's attempts to centralize power and assert control over the kingdom met with even greater resistance. The revolt had shown the nobility. In addition to weakening his relationship with the common people, Richard's failure to address the Peasants' Revolt contributed to the growing tension between the monarchy and the nobility. The nobles, who had initially supported Richard's reign, began to question his ability to govern effectively. The revolt demonstrated Richard's inability to manage the kingdom's affairs, and as the nobles grew more disillusioned with his rule, they began to challenge his authority. Richard's failure to navigate the revolt also exposed the fragility of the political system in England. Despite Richard's best efforts, he was unable to prevent the rebellion from growing, and his failure to manage the unrest revealed the weaknesses of the monarchy. As the revolt died down, Richard's attempts to regain control of the situation became more desperate, but the damage had already been done. The rebellion had demonstrated that the king's power was not absolute, and that the common people could rise up against the monarch. The lesson from this chapter is clear. A ruler must not only maintain the loyalty of their advisors and nobles, but also stay connected with the needs and grievances of the people. Richard's inability to address the concerns of the common people and his failure to manage the revolt led to the erosion of his authority. The long-term consequences of the revolt, both for Richard and for England, were profound. Richard's inability to reconcile the interests of the nobility, the common people, and his own Henry Bolingbroke's return. The return of Henry Bolingbroke in 1399 marked a decisive turning point in Richard II's reign. Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt, was exiled by Richard after a power struggle that saw him lose his inheritance. However, his return to England with a small army would eventually lead to the downfall of Richard II and the rise of a new monarchy. Bolingbroke's return was not merely the reclaiming of his own land, but the beginning of a challenge to Richard's rule, one that would ultimately overthrow. Bolingbroke had a legitimate claim to the throne through his paternal lineage, but his motives were not purely about inheritance. His exile had been politically motivated, and upon his return to England, he found himself supported by many of the nobles who had grown disillusioned with Richard's leadership. As Richard II had grown more authoritarian, he had alienated many of his allies in the court, leaving them vulnerable to Bolingbroke's appeal. Bolingbroke's support came from both the noble class and the discontented members of the court. Richard's inability to retain the loyalty of his subjects had made his position increasingly fragile. Many nobles who had once been loyal to Richard now saw Bolingbroke as a more promising ruler. In the months leading up to Bolingbroke's return, Richard had become increasingly isolated, surrounded by a circle of loyal but ineffective advisors, while Bolingbroke, by contrast, was able to rally the support of a faction eager for change. When Bolingbroke landed in England with his army, Richard, who had been away fighting in Ireland, was ill-prepared to handle the crisis. His response to the invasion was slow and ineffective, reflecting his growing weakness as a ruler. Bolingbroke's army marched quickly across the country, and it wasn't long before many of Richard's former supporters switched allegiance. Bolingbroke, in contrast to Richard, was able to present himself as a capable leader, promising stability and reform where Richard had failed. Richard's lack of response and the collapse of his support from key nobles made his position untenable. Richard's slow response to Bolingbroke's growing momentum allowed his opponent to gain a significant advantage, and Bolingbroke marched toward London with increasing numbers of supporters. Richard, unable to maintain control over his kingdom or his supporters, was faced with the inevitable. His reign, which had once been filled with promise, was now on the brink of collapse. The lesson here is the importance of maintaining control over one's court and not allowing discontent to fester among the nobility. Richard's failure to secure the loyalty of the most powerful members of his kingdom directly led to his downfall. A ruler must not only govern effectively, but also ensure that the power dynamics of their court remain in their favour. Bolingbroke's return was a reminder that no monarch is immune from rebellion, especially when their leadership is perceived as weak and disconnected. Richard II's fall, the rise of Henry IV. As Bolingbroke continued his march toward London, Richard II's fate seemed sealed. The young king, who had once been full of promise, now found himself powerless in the face of the rebellion that was growing in strength. Bolingbroke's campaign was swift and effective, and Richard's support among the nobility and common people quickly evaporated. What had once seemed like a steady rule now appeared to be crumbling in front of him, with Bolingbroke poised to take the throne. Richard's inability to respond decisively to the threat of Bolingbroke was a significant factor in his downfall. His leadership was already weakened by the internal divisions within his court, but his slow reaction to Bolingbroke's return further exacerbated the situation. As the king remained indecisive, many of his supporters defected to Bolingbroke's cause, realizing that the rising challenger was more capable of providing the stability and leadership England needed. The tension reached its peak when Richard finally faced Bolingbroke and his growing army. Richard, despite his position as king, was now the one being forced to negotiate. The monarchy had once been the bedrock of English rule, but Richard's inability to command the loyalty of his nobles had made it all too easy for Bolingbroke to gain support. The once proud king was now at the mercy of his rivals, and his defeat seemed inevitable. When Richard finally surrendered to Bolingbroke, it was clear that the reign of Richard II had come to an end. Bolingbroke, who had returned to England to reclaim his inheritance, had succeeded in securing the throne for himself. The transition of power from Richard to Bolingbroke was swift, with the nobles quickly switching their allegiance. The scene of Richard's downfall was one of humiliation, as he was forced to relinquish his crown and accept the consequences of his failure to maintain power. Bolingbroke's rise to power marked the beginning of the Lancastrian dynasty and the end of Richard II's reign. Once imprisoned, Richard II's life became increasingly isolated, and he would eventually die under suspicious circumstances. Bolingbroke, now crowned as Henry IV, took control of England, but the kingdom was left in a state of division and unrest. The political instability that had plagued Richard's reign would continue to affect the country, and Henry IV's rule was marked by his own struggle for legitimacy. Richard II's fall provides a valuable lesson about the fragility of power. Even a king with great promise can lose everything if they fail to secure the loyalty of those around them. Richard's failure to maintain control over his court, his impulsive decisions, and his inability to deal with the rising threat of Bolingbroke were the key factors that led to his downfall. His story serves as a cautionary tale for rulers who rely too heavily on advisors, ignore the needs of their people, and fail to navigate. The aftermath of Richard's fall. After Richard II was deposed by Henry Bolingbroke and forced to abdicate, the kingdom entered a new phase under the rule of Henry IV. Bolingbroke's rise to power marked the beginning of the Lancastrian dynasty, but Richard's downfall left deep scars in both the monarchy and the country. The political landscape of England had been forever altered by Richard's fall, and the events that followed were marked by instability, division, and struggles for control. Richard II's deposition was not merely the removal of a king, it was the collapse of a system of government that had relied on his authority. Bolingbroke's ascension to the throne created a new order, but it was one that was fraught with challenges. Henry IV, though a strong and capable ruler, faced constant threats to his legitimacy. The nobility, which had once supported Richard, now pledged allegiance to Henry IV, but many were still wary of the new king's hold on power. The aftermath of Richard's fall also had significant consequences for the common people. The Peasants Revolt of 1381 had exposed the deep social inequalities in England, and Richard's failure to address these issues had contributed to his downfall. Under Henry IV, the social and economic issues that had plagued the kingdom remained unresolved. The common people, though not directly involved in the political struggles of the nobility, continued to face the hardships of taxation, landlessness, and inequality. Richard's imprisonment after his deposition was a symbol of the decline of the monarchy. While Henry IV was able to consolidate his power, the memory of Richard's reign loomed large. Richard, once a young and hopeful king, was now a prisoner, his fate sealed by the very nobles who had once sworn allegiance to him. His downfall was not just a political event, it was a personal tragedy that marked the end of his rule and the beginning of a new era in English history. The long-term consequences of Richard's fall were far-reaching. The political instability that followed his deposition would continue to affect England for generations. The Lancastrian dynasty, though founded by Bolingbroke, would face its own struggles with legitimacy and power. The Wars of the Roses, a series of civil wars between the houses of Lancaster and York would soon follow, further destabilizing the kingdom. Richard's fall serves as a powerful reminder of the fragility of power. Even a king with a strong claim to the throne can lose everything if they fail to maintain control over their kingdom and manage the relationships with their nobles. Richard's inability to navigate the political landscape of his time, his failure to assert his authority, and his lack of foresight led to his downfall. His story provides important lessons for future rulers about the need to balance power, maintain alliances, and understand the pulse of the nation. Richard II's fall and its impact on the kingdom. The fall of Richard II was not only a personal tragedy for the king, but also marked a critical moment in the political history of England. The Lancastrian dynasty, established by Henry IV, replaced the Plantagenet line, and the impact of Richard's fall was felt throughout the kingdom. Bolingbroke's rise to power, though seen as a necessary step for the stability of England, marked the end of a period of political and royal uncertainty that had plagued the kingdom during Richard's reign. Richard's inability to maintain control over his court and manage the complex web of political allegiances left him vulnerable to Bolingbroke's challenge. The nobles, who had once supported Richard, gradually shifted their loyalty toward Bolingbroke, recognizing that his claim to the throne was not only more legitimate, but also supported by a growing faction of disgruntled nobles. Richard's failed attempt to assert authority in the face of rising opposition allowed his rivals to seize the throne, changing. The impact of Richard II's downfall was far-reaching. The political instability that defined his reign did not disappear with the rise of Henry IV. The kingdom remained divided, with rival factions continuing to vie for control. The rise of the Lancastrian dynasty marked the beginning of a new era in English history, but it also set the stage for further civil conflict. The Wars of the Roses, a series of dynastic wars between the houses of Lancaster and York, would follow, ensuring that the political Richard II's fall also had profound implications for the monarchy. The power of the English king, once seen as absolute, was now openly challenged. The monarch was no longer above the law or the political machinations of the nobility. Richard's failure to assert his authority and defend his throne demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most powerful rulers. His fall set a precedent for future monarchs, reminding them that their power was never guaranteed and that maintaining control over both the consequences of Richard's downfall were not just political, but also personal. The once king was imprisoned and died under mysterious circumstances, likely as a result of starvation or neglect. His death, though it occurred after his deposition, marked the final end of his reign. Richard II, once a young monarch full of promise, ended his life in obscurity and despair, having lost not only his throne, but also his legacy as a ruler. The lesson of Richard II's fall is that power is fragile, and the monarchy must be able to adapt to changing political dynamics. The king must be able to maintain the loyalty of the nobility, manage the grievances of the common people, and assert his authority when necessary. Richard's failure to do so led to his downfall, and the consequences of his actions were felt for generations. His story serves as a reminder that a ruler must never take their power for granted and must always be vigilant in Richard II's legacy and the lessons of his reign. The story of Richard II is a tale of ambition, failure, and ultimately a warning for future rulers. His reign, though brief, was marked by his desire to assert power and challenge the established political order. Yet, despite his intelligence and early promise, Richard failed to navigate the complex world of medieval politics. His fall from power and the consequences of his reign serve as a reminder of the fragile nature of kingship and the dangers of overreaching. Richard's reign began with high hopes. As a young king, he had the opportunity to make a significant mark on history. However, his early reliance on advisors, his inability to balance the needs of the nobility and common people, and his tendency to make rash decisions undermined his authority. His attempts to centralize power were met with resistance from the powerful noble families who had long been accustomed to controlling key aspects of governance. As Richard pushed against this system, he alienated key. Richard II's downfall is a stark reminder of the importance of managing relationships with the nobility. A ruler's power cannot be sustained without the support of those who hold significant political and military power. Richard's failure to recognize the importance of securing the loyalty of the nobles contributed directly to his downfall. His tendency to act impulsively and without full consideration of the long-term consequences of his actions weakened his position and left him vulnerable to challenge. Another crucial lesson from Richard's reign is the importance of maintaining control over one's court and government. Richard's reliance on a small group of advisors and his inability to effectively manage the various factions within his court made it easier for rival groups to gain power. A ruler must always be aware of the political dynamics around them and ensure that no faction becomes too powerful. Richard's failure to maintain this balance allowed Bolingbroke to rally support and ultimately seize the throne. The impact of Richard's reign and his eventual fall was felt long after his death. The rise of the Lancastrian dynasty, with Henry IV assuming the throne, marked a shift in England's political landscape. Richard's story became a cautionary tale for future monarchs, reminding them that power must be earned and maintained, not taken for granted. His downfall set the stage for a series of conflicts that would shake the foundations of the English monarchy, culminating in the Wars of the Roses. Richard II's reign serves as a powerful lesson in leadership, governance, and the importance of political wisdom. A ruler who fails to maintain strong relationships with their advisors and nobles, who overreaches in their attempts to centralize power, and who is unable to navigate the complexities of court politics, is doomed to failure. Richard's legacy is one of missed opportunities and unfulfilled potential, and his reign serves as a cautionary reminder that even the most promising monarchs can fail. Richard II's legacy, a cautionary tale for future rulers. The story of Richard II stands as a somber reminder of the delicate balance required to maintain power. His reign, marked by youthful ambition and political mistakes, serves as a cautionary tale for future rulers about the importance of wise governance and the consequences of failing to navigate the complex world of politics. Richard, once a promising monarch, lost his throne not because of a lack of potential, but because of his inability to maintain control over his kingdom and the division. The downfall of Richard II can be attributed to several key factors. One of the primary reasons for his fall was his inability to secure the loyalty of the nobility. In medieval England, the power of the king was often contingent on the support of the powerful noble families. Richard's attempts to reduce their influence and centralize power in the monarchy alienated many of his key supporters. His decision to rely on a small circle of advisors rather than engaging with the broader nobility further isolated. Richard II's failure to understand the complexities of court politics and his inability to balance the interests of various factions within his kingdom led to his downfall. His reign was marked by internal strife, with nobles and commoners alike disillusioned by his actions. The Peasants Revolt of 1381, though eventually quelled, demonstrated the widespread dissatisfaction with Richard's leadership. His inability to address the root causes of unrest and to maintain control over both the nobility and the collapse of Richard II's reign underscores the importance of maintaining a strong relationship with both the nobility and the common people. Richard's failure to address the grievances of his subjects, especially the lower classes, and his failure to secure the loyalty of the powerful nobles weakened his position. A ruler must always balance the demands of the aristocracy with the needs of the people, understanding that both groups play a critical role in the stability of the kingdom. In the years after Richard's fall, his legacy was debated by historians, political thinkers, and future rulers. The story of Richard II's reign became a powerful lesson in the fragility of power and the necessity of maintaining strong relationships with key factions within the kingdom. While Richard's reign was not without its successes, it was ultimately defined by his failure to sustain his authority, navigate court politics, and secure his position within the political structure of medieval England. Richard II's fall and its impact on future rulers. The collapse of Richard II's reign was not just the end of a monarchy, it was a reflection of the instability that could occur when a ruler fails to properly manage power, relationships, and expectations. Richard's fall from grace was the direct result of his inability to balance his ambitions with the practicalities of ruling a kingdom. His tragic downfall offers important lessons for future rulers about the dangers of overreaching and the consequences of alienating the very people who come. One of the most significant factors in Richard II's downfall was his failure to assert strong leadership and maintain control over the key political factions in his court. While he had the formal authority of the crown, Richard did not command the respect and loyalty of the nobles. His desire to centralize power in the hands of the monarchy created tension within the court and alienated many of the powerful noble families. By failing to manage these relationships effectively, Richard lost the trust. The rise of Henry IV and the subsequent establishment of the Lancastrian dynasty marked the end of Richard's reign, but also signalled a shift in the political landscape of England. Bolingbroke's successful challenge to Richard's rule demonstrated how quickly the balance of power could shift, and it highlighted the vulnerability of even the most powerful rulers when they fail to maintain strong alliances and manage internal conflicts. Henry IV's ascent to the throne also set a precedent for future royal. Richard II's fall had lasting consequences not only for England, but for the monarchy itself. The political instability that followed his reign became a defining feature of the Wars of the Roses, a period of civil war that would plague England for generations. The division between the houses of Lancaster and York, sparked by Richard's downfall, led to decades of bloodshed and uncertainty. The legacy of Richard's reign thus becomes intertwined with the future struggles for control of the throne and the division. Future monarchs would look to Richard II's reign as a lesson in the importance of maintaining control over both the nobility and the common people. The failure to secure the loyalty of the powerful noble families, the inability to address the grievances of the lower classes, and the lack of political foresight all contributed to Richard's downfall. A ruler who cannot balance these pressures risks their own destruction, as Richard learned to his peril. In addition to the political lessons Richard II's reign provides, it also serves as a reminder of the personal responsibility of rulers. Richard, as a monarch, was entrusted with the well-being of his people and the stability of the realm. His failure to navigate the complexities of kingship, coupled with his inability to listen to his advisors and understand the needs of his subjects, ultimately led to the end of his reign and the loss of his throne. His legacy is a powerful cautionary tale about Richard II's legacy, the fragility of power. The ultimate lesson from Richard II's reign is the fragility of power. Despite being crowned at a young age and initially receiving the hopes and expectations of his people, Richard's inability to navigate the political landscape of England led to his downfall. His reign serves as a cautionary tale for future monarchs, demonstrating that even the most powerful individuals can fall from grace if they fail to secure their position and maintain the loyalty of their supporters. Richard II's reign was marked by a series of missteps that ultimately led to his deposition. One of his most significant failures was his inability to maintain control over the nobility. Richard's attempts to centralize power and diminish the influence of the aristocracy alienated many of his most important allies. His failure to effectively balance the interests of the nobility with the needs of the kingdom ultimately led to the rebellion of Bolingbroke and the eventual rise of the Lancastrian dynasty. The political instability caused by Richard's reign had a long-lasting impact on England. The weakening of the monarchy and the growing power of the nobility contributed to the social unrest that would lead to the Wars of the Roses. The conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York would dominate English politics for decades to come, with Richard's downfall serving as the catalyst for this bloody and divisive period in history. His inability to establish strong political alliances and his failure to Richard II's tragic end also highlights the importance of a ruler's ability to maintain control over their court. A king or queen must understand the dynamics of their court, forge alliances with powerful factions, and avoid alienating those who hold sway over the kingdom's fate. Richard's failure to do so resulted in his imprisonment and eventual death, marking the end of his reign and the beginning of a new era under Henry IV. The legacy of Richard II is one of lessons learned too late. His story teaches future rulers about the importance of wisdom, political strategy, and the ability to recognize when to compromise and when to stand firm. A monarch must maintain the loyalty of both their nobles and their people, ensuring that their reign remains stable and secure. Richard's failure to do so left England in a state of turmoil and instability, and his story serves as a warning to those who would follow in his footsteps. In conclusion, Richard II's reign and its tragic end highlight the delicate nature of power and the responsibility that comes with it. A ruler must be capable of navigating complex political relationships, managing the expectations of both the nobility and the common people, and, above all, maintaining their authority in the face of adversity. Richard's inability to do so ultimately led to his downfall, but his legacy serves as a valuable reminder of the importance of wise and effective leadership.